She walked into that bar to forget, but fate was already waiting for her. Elena, a woman haunted by secrets buried deep inside a corrupt law firm, meets Adrian, a man running from ghosts of his own. One night of passion becomes a collision course between truth and deception, between love and survival. What begins as a fleeting escape soon unravels into a dark conspiracy that stretches from the city's underworld to the highest halls of power. Every touch hides a secret. Every kiss conceals a lie. When a paralegal with too many questions and a forensic investigator with too many scars fall into each other's arms, the night doesn't end at sunrise. It ignites a mystery that could destroy them both. Before we continue, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Subscribe if you haven't. There's a lot of interesting stories coming up. Now back to the story. The bar glowed in the hush of late evening, its amber lamps spilling warm halos across scarred wooden tables. Shadows stretched long, blending into each other, as though the place itself wanted to keep the secrets of those who entered. Glasses clinked, ice cracked, and the murmur of conversations rose and fell like a tide. Outside, the city pulsed with urgency. But in here, time slowed, softened, and wrapped itself in velvet tones of jazz humming from a tired speaker. Elena sat alone at the far end, her fingers tracing idle circles around the rim of a half-empty wine glass. Her dress, a deep burgundy satin chosen on a whim, clung to her frame, the color flattering against the smooth warmth of her bronze skin. Stray strands of her chestnut-brown hair slipped from a loosely tied bun, falling across her cheek each time she tilted her head. Her eyes, almond-shaped and restless, flickered with the kind of sadness that belonged to someone carrying too much, but telling no one. She had not intended to come here. Hours earlier, she'd been in her office, staring down at a letter with her name typed neatly at the bottom. Her resignation, unsubmitted, unsigned. It sat on the edge of her desk, as though daring her to make a choice she was too afraid to finalize. The law firm that once seemed like stability had turned into a labyrinth of shadows. She had uncovered files she was never meant to see, evidence of money being funneled into places no one could explain, contracts signed by clients who never appeared in person, documents stamped with urgency but missing entire sections of truth. And then there was the note, left carelessly or intentionally on her desk that afternoon. Some truths are better left buried. She read it again and again until the words blurred, until her chest tightened with the reminder that she wasn't just a spectator anymore. She was a liability. By 5 o'clock, her hands were trembling. She told her colleagues she needed air, but she didn't go home. Home felt dangerous, too quiet, too predictable. Instead, her feet carried her through the maze of streets until she found herself outside this bar, an anonymous place tucked into the city's folds, where no one would know her name, her fears, or the secrets gnawing at her. Now, seated in the dim light, she pressed her thumb into the rim of her glass until it hurt. She wanted the wine to blur the edges of her thoughts, to hush the paranoia echoing in her chest. She wanted to forget that she had ever seen documents stamped with signatures that didn't match, numbers that pointed towards something darker than negligence. Elena exhaled, her lips parting in a sigh she didn't realize she had been holding. For one night, she told herself, she would surrender. Not to fear, not to the what-ifs chasing her, but to anonymity. She could be anyone here. A stranger with no past, no burdens. Just a woman drinking alone in a bar with lights soft enough to make her believe the world outside didn't exist. But the weight of who she really was pressed in like smoke under a locked door. Her reflection in the wine glass reminded her of the truths she couldn't outrun. A paralegal trapped in the web of a failing firm. A daughter who had given up her dreams of journalism to care for her ailing father. A woman whose engagement had crumbled under betrayal. And yet beneath all of it, her heart beat with a quiet defiance. She had noticed too much. She couldn't unknow what she knew. She couldn't erase the growing suspicion that the wrong set of eyes had already noticed her noticing. Her phone buzzed on the table, startling her. A message lit the screen. Mara, her best friend since college. "Dinner tomorrow? You've been ghosting me again?" Elena's lips curved in a faint smile, though her chest tightened. She typed a quick response. "Yes, tomorrow. Promise," before setting the phone face down, away from the swirl of guilt she carried. It was then that her gaze drifted across the bar. That's when she saw him, Adrian. Though she didn't know his name yet, he carried the kind of presence that made the rest of the room dissolve. He stood at the entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, his black coat dusted faintly with rain. His hair, thick, dark, slightly tousled as if he had run his fingers through it too many times that night, framed a face marked by sharp lines, a strong jaw, and eyes so intense they seemed to catch and hold the light. There was something in those eyes, gray, restless, that mirrored her own loneliness. He scanned the bar, as though searching for silence in the chatter, and then his gaze landed on her. It lingered, too long to be casual, too measured to be accidental. See, hours earlier, Adrian had stood in a morgue staring down at a nameless body with a tattoo that stirred something unsettling inside him. The morgue was always cold, a sterile chill that clung to Adrian's skin long after he left. Tonight, though, it felt colder than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He stood over the steel table, his gloved hands motionless, eyes fixed on the body beneath the white sheet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, humming in rhythm with his thoughts. He had seen countless bodies in his years as a forensic investigator, accidents, overdoses, crimes that spoke of desperation rather than cruelty. But this one was different. The woman had been found in a narrow alley, no identification, no phone, no purse. A ghost. Her throat bore the faint bruising of strangulation, deliberate and unforgiving. And then there were the details, the ones that burrowed beneath Adrian's skin. A tattoo on her wrist, half erased as though someone had tried to burn it away. A ring on her finger, silver dulled with age, the inside crudely carved with initials. LM. Adrian leaned closer, tracing the edges of the ring with his eyes. He didn't recognize the initials, but something about them gnawed at him, the way a half-remembered dream clings in the hours after waking. He snapped a photo for the records, then carefully slipped the ring into an evidence bag. "Another Jane Doe," muttered his colleague, Dr. Hahn, as he scribbled notes onto a clipboard. "Probably a drifter. Nobody's going to come looking." Adrian straightened, pulling off his gloves. His jaw tightened. "Everyone comes from somewhere. Someone loved her once." Hahn shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe she's exactly where she was meant to end up. This city swallows people whole." Adrian didn't reply. He had heard variations of the same phrase too many times. Police officers, detectives, even coroners, as if dismissing the dead somehow made their own jobs easier. But Adrian couldn't shake the faces, not even after he filed the paperwork and signed off on the reports. He carried them home, into his dreams, into the silence of his apartment where every shadow seemed to whisper unfinished stories. He stripped off his lab coat and hung it neatly on the hook. But the weight didn't leave his shoulders. As he pushed open the heavy door of the morgue, the smell of antiseptic still clung to his skin. Outside, the city air hit him like a wall, humid, alive with the echo of car horns and distant music spilling from bars. People passed him on the street, laughing, smoking, living. The stark contrast between their ease and the woman's lifeless body twisted something inside him. He paused at the corner, hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the glowing neon sign of a late-night diner across the street. He thought briefly of going home, of pouring himself a stiff drink and numbing the questions spiraling in his head. But the idea of his apartment, its silence, its untouched dishes, its hollow solitude, made his chest tighten. He needed noise. He needed distraction. He needed to feel alive in a way the morgue never allowed. And so, without planning it, his feet carried him down a different street, one lined with bars, the hum of conversations spilling through doorways and the occasional burst of laughter breaking the night. As he walked, he replayed the scene in his mind. The tattoo, the initials, the bruising. Something about it didn't feel random. He had seen plenty of victims with tragic, forgettable stories, robberies gone wrong, lovers' quarrels that escalated too far. But this felt like a message. He hated that word, message. It suggested intent, a larger design. And in his line of work, larger designs always meant darker truths. By the time he reached the bar, his thoughts were a tangle. He didn't even notice the flicker of the neon sign above the door until he pushed it open and stepped into the dim glow. Scanning through the bar, he immediately noticed Elena, and they locked eyes. Elena's heart jolted in her chest, a strange recognition she couldn't name tugging at her. She turned her eyes back to her wine, telling herself not to read into it. But the magnetic pull was undeniable. She glanced back. He was still watching. He moved with quiet confidence, threading through the bar until he reached the counter. He ordered a whiskey, his voice low, steady, and then he didn't sit at the counter. He turned, glass in hand, and walked toward her. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She straightened unconsciously, adjusting the strap of her dress, suddenly aware of the loose tendril of hair grazing her cheek. For a second, she thought of leaving, slipping out the door before the moment unraveled into something. The first thing Elena noticed when he sat down was his silence. Not the awkward kind, but the deliberate, weighted silence of someone who carried entire worlds in his chest and chose carefully which fragments to release. He set his whiskey down gently, the amber liquid catching the glow of the lamp, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed to tighten, not uncomfortably, but like a taut string waiting to vibrate. Elena's pulse quickened, though she masked it with a faint smile, the kind that invited conversation while protecting her from revealing too much. "You don't look like you belong here," she said finally, her voice soft, teasing, just enough to break the stillness. Adrian tilted his head, studying her with eyes that seemed to carry both sharpness and sorrow. "Funny," he replied, lips curving into the faintest smile. "I was about to say the same thing." Elena let out a laugh, short, genuine, surprising even to herself. She hadn't laughed all day, not since that note appeared on her desk like a whisper of danger. But with him, the sound slipped out easily, as if her body recognized something before her mind could catch up. The bartender passed by, and Adrian lifted a finger, signaling for another glass of wine for her without asking if she wanted one. It should have irritated her, this assumption, but instead it disarmed her. She raised a brow. "Confident, aren't you?" "Not confident," Adrian said, swirling his glass slowly. "Observant. You were nursing that last sip as though you wanted more but didn't want to seem like you did." Her cheeks warmed, not from the wine but from the way he had noticed. Most men only looked at the surface. He looked past it, into the quiet spaces where she thought she was invisible. They slipped into conversation with the ease of people who had been circling the same orbit for years without knowing it. Adrian told her in vague strokes about his work, never naming the morgue, never saying forensics, only hinting at long nights, reports, details that most people would rather not face. Elena, guarded at first, confessed she worked at a law firm, omitting the corruption, the files, the suffocating dread. Their truths remained half-told, but their laughter was whole, filling the dim bar like light bleeding into shadows. The hours blurred. One drink became two. Two became three. Each glass loosened the strings they had tied around themselves, allowing fragments of honesty to slip through. Elena leaned forward, chin resting lightly on her hand, her eyes sparkling with the rare kind of amusement that had been absent from her life for far too long. "So, Adrian," she said, finally prying his name from him, "tell me, Do you often sit down with strangers in bars and buy them wine? He smirked, leaning closer, his voice low enough that it felt like a secret shared only with her. Only when they look like they're about to run from something. Her breath caught, just for a second. The words struck deeper than he knew. She disguised it with another sip of wine, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the heat crawling up her neck. "And what about you?" she asked, forcing steadiness into her tone. "What are you running from?" For the first time, his gaze faltered. It drifted past her, toward the glowing bottles lined along the bar, before returning to her eyes. His smile lingered, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. "That," he said quietly, "would take more than a few drinks to explain." She didn't push. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand on the table. The touch was feather-light, almost accidental, but neither of them pulled away. The electricity in that brief contact was undeniable, startling in its intensity. They sat there, suspended, their hands nearly entwined, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then, as though afraid the moment might dissolve if they hesitated too long, Adrian leaned closer. "Do you want to get out of here?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them dared to fully unpack. Elena's chest tightened. Every rational part of her screamed to say no, that she didn't know him, that she was already entangled in enough shadows that she didn't need another complication. But rationality crumbled under the weight of the ache she carried. She was tired of fear, tired of secrets, tired of waking every morning with the sense that her life was a script written by someone else. She wanted, if only for one night, to feel alive again. Her lips curved into a small, daring smile. "Yes." They left together, the door swinging shut behind them, cutting off the hum of the bar. Outside, the city greeted them with the cool kiss of midnight air. Neon lights bled across wet pavement, and the sound of distant traffic hummed like a heartbeat. They didn't speak as they walked. They didn't need to. Their hands brushed once, twice, until Adrian's fingers finally closed around hers with a certainty that startled her. It wasn't the grip of a man trying to claim. It was the hold of someone who didn't want the moment to slip away. Elena's pulse hammered in her throat, but she didn't pull away. When they reached his apartment, a modest space tucked into the corner of a quiet street, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar wood and coffee, warm and lived in. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting a golden wash over the books that lay stacked like neglected monuments on the shelves. The rain that had just started outside whispering against the windows, soft, steady, as if the night itself were urging them to slow down. Elena stood just inside the doorway, her coat still clinging to her shoulders, her breath uneven. She hadn't expected to feel this alive, her skin humming, her pulse quickening with every glance he gave her. The world outside seemed like a distant memory, a place where resignation letters and cryptic notes and silent fears waited for her return. Here, in this space, there was only Adrian. He stepped closer, his presence filling the air, steady but charged. His eyes lingered on her, not as though he were studying her body, but as if he were memorizing her. Every curve, every line, every unspoken ache. "Do you want a drink?" he asked, his voice low, velvet thick with restraint. Her lips curved in a small, nervous smile. "Do I look like I need one?" He shook his head, his mouth tugging into the faintest smile. "You look like you need something else." Her heart stuttered at his honesty. No pretense, no clumsy small talk, just truth laid bare between them. She let her coat slip from her shoulders, pooling silently onto the floor. The gesture felt like a choice, an unspoken answer to his question. Adrian's breath caught, but he didn't lunge, didn't rush. He closed the space slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his fingertips grazing her cheek with the lightness of reverence. "Elena," he murmured, her name catching in his throat as though it mattered more than he wanted it to. She tilted her chin, her lips parting, and when his mouth found hers, the world fractured. The kiss was not tentative. It was hungry, desperate, like two souls who had been circling each other for years and had finally collided. Her fingers found the back of his neck, pulling him closer while his hands pressed against the small of her back, anchoring her, claiming her in the most fragile, human way. Each touch was a question and an answer. "Do you need this?" "Yes." "Will you let me in?" "Yes." Clothes loosened, slipped, fell away, not with haste, but with laughter. Laughter that surprised them both. She giggled when his shirt buttons refused to cooperate. He grinned when her dress tangled around her wrists. The clumsy humanity of it made the intimacy sharper, more real. When at last they stood skin against skin, there was no more hesitation. He kissed her again, softer this time, savoring rather than claiming. She felt his breath warm against her throat, the tremor in his hands betraying the control he worked so hard to maintain. She wasn't the only one trembling. In the glow of the lamplight, shadows painted their bodies, long and unending. Every whisper, every sigh, every brush of lips against skin wove them tighter together until the room itself seemed to spin around them. For those hours, time dissolved. Elena let go of everything. The fear that had been clawing at her since the note appeared on her desk, the weight of corruption she had stumbled upon, the heartbreaks she had tucked away like scars. She clung to Adrian as if he were a lifeline, as if his presence could anchor her in a reality where the world wasn't unraveling. And Adrian kissed her like a man trying to forget. The morgue, the faceless body with its half-burned tattoo, the initials carved into a ring that haunted him, all of it faded in the heat of her touch. For once, he wasn't cataloging, analyzing, or questioning. He was simply here, in this moment, with her. Later, tangled in his sheets, Elena lay against him, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It soothed her, lulled her into the illusion that she was safe. She traced lazy circles across his skin, memorizing the texture, the warmth, as though she could preserve it against the inevitable cruelty of dawn. "You're quiet," she whispered into the darkness. Adrian's hand moved slowly through her hair. "So are you." She smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it in the shadows. "Maybe we're both afraid to ruin it by talking." He pressed a kiss against her forehead, his lips lingering just long enough to betray what he didn't say aloud, that she was right. Words could break the spell, could remind them of what waited outside these walls. And so they stayed quiet, speaking instead in touches, in breaths, in the silent language of two people who knew the night was temporary but needed it desperately anyway. They explored each other's bodies and made intense love till they climaxed and let go of each other. As the hours slipped by, Elena drifted into a light sleep, her body curling instinctively toward his. But Adrian remained awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield of questions. Who was she, really? Why did her sadness feel so familiar, her silence so weighted? Why did she feel less like a stranger and more like a puzzle piece sliding into place in a life he hadn't realized was incomplete? His gaze shifted to the nightstand, where her lipstick-stained wine glass sat beside his whiskey. Two vessels, side by side, empty but marked by presence. Something about it unsettled him. Something about her unsettled him. But when she stirred in her sleep, nestling closer, his hand instinctively curved around her back. The questions could wait. For now, he allowed himself the dangerous luxury of believing that the tenderness was real, that it might last beyond dawn. He knew better. She knew better, too. But still, neither of them let go. The morning arrived without mercy. Elena stirred first, her eyes fluttering open to the thin blade of sunlight slicing through the curtains. For a moment, disoriented and weightless, she allowed herself to pretend the night before hadn't ended. The sheets still held the warmth of Adrian's skin, the faint cedarwood scent lingered in the air, and her cheek rested against the steady rise and fall of his chest. But then the city intruded, horns echoing faintly in the distance, footsteps on the pavement below, the world calling them back from the cocoon of the night. Reality pressed in. She turned her head slightly, studying him as he slept. Adrian's face was softer now, stripped of the guardedness he had carried like armor in the bar. The hard lines of his jaw were relaxed, his lashes casting delicate shadows across his cheekbones. In sleep, he seemed almost vulnerable, like the weight he bore had loosened its grip. She traced a fingertip lightly over his arm, memorizing the feel of him, the shape of this fleeting intimacy. She knew better than to believe it would last. Morning always revealed truths the night tried to bury. Adrian stirred, his eyes opening slowly. For the briefest second, they softened when they landed on her, as though he had forgotten where he was, who she was, and simply recognized warmth. But then, as though a switch had been flipped, his expression shifted. The softness faded, replaced by distance, distraction. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Elena forced a small smile. "Morning." He pressed a kiss against her cheek, light, polite, nothing like the hunger of the night before. Then he swung his legs over the side of the bed, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. Within seconds, his eyes were glued to the screen, his thumb scrolling with mechanical precision. The distance between them widened with every second of silence. Elena sat up slowly, clutching the sheet to her chest, the weight of his detachment pressing down on her. She told herself she shouldn't be surprised. This was what she had agreed to, wasn't it? Just one night, just one escape. And yet the ache in her chest betrayed her. She rose quietly, gathering her clothes from the floor. The laughter they had shared as their clothes fell away felt almost mocking now, echoes of a moment already dissolving. She slipped her dress back on, smoothing the wrinkles with trembling hands, and reached for her heels. It was then she noticed it, on the desk by the window, half buried beneath a stack of papers. A manila folder, thick and worn, its label written in block letters, homicide, unidentified female. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't meant to look, but her eyes betrayed her. The edge of a photograph peeked from the folder, black and white, blurred. She couldn't make out the details, but the image alone was enough to send a chill racing down her spine. Elena froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. She told herself it was nothing, that it was just work, that she had stumbled into the life of a man whose profession intersected with shadows she didn't want to touch. But her instincts screamed otherwise. The initials carved into the ring in that file, though she hadn't seen them, felt dangerously close to the ones she had glimpsed weeks ago in a folder at her firm. Coincidence, she told herself. It had to be. "Everything okay?" Adrian's voice startled her. She turned quickly, forcing a smile, her hand tightening around her purse. He stood by the dresser, already half-dressed, his shirt hanging loose around his frame. His eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, as though he sensed the tremor in her silence. "Yeah," she lied. "Just finding my things." He nodded, though his gaze lingered a second too long, suspicion flickering there. Then he turned back to his phone, the screen lighting his face with a cold glow. Elena slipped into her heels, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, anything, to reclaim the closeness they had shared only hours before. But the words died in her mouth. What could she say? That she wanted more than one night? That she had noticed the folder and was now tangled in questions she wasn't ready to ask? Instead, she crossed the room to him. She leaned in, pressed her lips softly against his cheek, the gesture tender but heavy with unsaid things. "Thank you," she whispered. For what? The distraction, the laughter, the illusion of connection? She didn't know. She only knew that the words felt like a goodbye. Adrian smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Take care, Elena." Her chest constricted. She wanted him to stop her, to ask her to stay, to look at her the way he had last night when their worlds had shrunk to nothing but breath and skin and longing. But he didn't. She turned and walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. The sound of the latch clicking behind her felt final, like the closing of a chapter she hadn't wanted to end. Outside, the morning was cruelly bright. The city bustled with life, oblivious to the hollow ache blooming in her chest. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the memory of his warmth already fading against the chill. As she walked down the street, her mind replayed the night, his touch, his laughter, the way his eyes had searched hers like they were both drowning. But the memory of the folder loomed larger, darker. Homicide, unidentified female. It clung to her, whispering questions she didn't want to answer. She told herself she would forget, that this night, like so many choices in her past, would dissolve into nothing more than a memory. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous than either of them had realized. And as Elena disappeared into the crowd, Adrian stood in his apartment, staring at the lipstick-stained glass she had left behind. He touched it once, his thumb smudging the print, his mind already turning over the faint recognition he couldn't quite place. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it. They weren't strangers anymore. They were entangled. The apartment was too quiet once she left. Adrian stood in the middle of the room, shirt still unbuttoned, staring at the door that had just closed behind Elena. The echo of her presence lingered, the faint floral trace of her perfume, the wrinkle of sheets on his bed, the lipstick mark curved around the rim of the glass she had abandoned on the table. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. One night. That was all it was supposed to be. A collision of loneliness and chemistry, nothing more. Yet even as he told himself this, he couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest. His eyes returned to the lipstick-stained glass. He lifted it, turning it in his hand, the smear of red catching the light. Something about it unsettled him. Not the intimacy of it, the vulnerability of letting someone leave their trace behind, but the familiarity. He couldn't explain it, but a part of him felt as though he had seen this before, somewhere outside the walls of his apartment. Adrian set the glass down, trying to shake the thought. He had work to do. The homicide file still lay open on his desk, a silent reminder of the life he lived outside of fleeting nights like this. He pulled the folder closer, flipping it open, his eyes scanning the contents once more. The photographs stared back at him, the woman's lifeless body, the bruises circling her throat, the tattoo half erased on her wrist, and the ring. Always the ring. The initials carved crudely inside. LM. Adrian frowned, leaning back in his chair. The initials tugged at something buried deep in his memory, a whisper from another case, another time. He flipped through the notes, searching for a connection. Nothing. Just the usual details. Cause of death, estimated time, condition of the body. Clinical, detached. But his gut told him otherwise. He rubbed his temples, closing his eyes. In the morgue, he had forced himself to stay objective, to catalog, to record. Now, alone, he allowed the unease to surface. The tattoo, though blurred, partially destroyed, felt like a symbol he had glimpsed once before, buried in a forgotten case file. And the initials. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his thoughts. A message from Detective Clara Voss. "Need you back at the morgue." Something new came up with Jane Doe. Adrian grabbed his jacket, slipping it on with hurried movements. But before he left, his gaze caught once more on the lipstick-stained glass. He hesitated, then set it carefully aside, as though preserving evidence he didn't yet know how to name. The morgue was colder than ever, its silence oppressive. Clara stood by the table, her arms folded, her expression tight. She was sharp-eyed, always catching details others missed, and tonight her gaze flicked to Adrian with a hint of curiosity he didn't like. "You're late," she said, though it hadn't been more than 20 minutes since her text. "Traffic," he lied, hanging his coat. "What's new?" She nodded toward the table. "Autopsy turned up something you'll want to see." Adrian pulled on gloves, his heart rate quickening as he stepped closer. The body lay as he remembered, silent, bruised, anonymous. But now, on the tray beside her, lay the ring, cleaned and polished. The initials inside were clearer now. LM and something else. An inscription so faint it had been overlooked before. Numbers. A date. Adrian leaned in, reading the worn engraving, SoFi 14. His pulse stumbled. The date was familiar. Too familiar. He had seen it once before, in a case file involving financial crimes, a whistleblower who had died under suspicious circumstances. He had always suspected her death was no accident. And now, years later, the same date resurfaced, carved inside the ring of a strangled woman. "This isn't random," Adrian murmured, his throat dry. Clara arched a brow. "You recognize it?" Adrian hesitated, the weight of caution pressing down. Clara was a good detective, maybe one of the few he trusted, but trust in his world was never absolute. "Maybe," he said finally. "Need more time to be sure." Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. "You've been off since you left earlier. Something happen?" Her question hung heavier than it should have. He thought of Elena, the way she had looked at him across the bar, the way her fingers had traced patterns on the rim of her glass, the way her eyes had glimmered with secrets she hadn't spoken. He thought of the folder on his desk, the way she had lingered by it a moment too long before leaving. "Nothing," he said too quickly, turning away. "Just tired." But as he peeled off his gloves, Adrian knew it wasn't nothing. Something about Elena unsettled him. Not the intimacy of their night, but the flicker of recognition that nagged at the back of his mind. He had seen her eyes before, not in person, but in the sharp lines of a photograph. He couldn't place where, but the memory lurked, just out of reach. Back at his apartment later that night, he dug through his old files, pulling out boxes he hadn't touched in years. Cases that had been closed too quickly, evidence that had slipped through cracks no one bothered to patch. He flipped through reports, photographs, names scrawled across manila folders. And then he found it. A file from 3 years ago. The whistleblower's case. A woman who had tried to expose financial corruption tied to several law firms. Officially, her death was ruled an overdose. Unofficially, Adrian had always believed she was silenced. He spread the photographs across his desk, his chest tightening as he studied them, the tattoo on her wrist, the initials connected to her files, the same pattern, the same shadows. And then, buried in the paperwork, he found a reference to a law firm name. His eyes froze on the words. The same law firm Elena had said she worked for. His breath left him in a harsh exhale. It couldn't be coincidence. The ache in his gut deepened, twisting into something sharp, something dangerous. Elena hadn't just wandered into his life by accident. Their night together, their connection. It might have been chance, but it was entangled with something far darker than either of them had admitted. Adrian sank back into his chair, staring at the photographs, the files, the lipstick-stained glass glinting on his table. His pulse thundered in his ears. Had Elena walked into his life by accident? Or had fate pulled them together for reasons neither of them could survive? The city outside carried on, oblivious. But in Adrian's apartment, two lives, his and Elena's, had already begun to intertwine, knotted by shadows neither of them could escape. And as the night wore on, one truth settled over him like a storm cloud. This was no longer just a case. It was personal, and he wasn't sure whether that terrified him or thrilled him. Years before the dimly lit bar and the fleeting, intoxicating night with a beautiful stranger, Elena had a different life, one fueled by the relentless fire of ambition. She dreamed of becoming a journalist, not the kind who simply reported on events, but the kind who chased truth, who dug through the layers of deception to expose corruption. The world, in her young eyes, was a series of puzzles waiting to be solved, and she was born to be a detective of the written word. Her graduate school years were a blur of late-night library sessions, the scent of old paper and coffee a familiar comfort. She was alive, vibrant, and on a path that felt as true as a North Star. She had a mentor, an old-school investigative journalist who saw the same restless fire in her eyes that Elena saw in her own reflection. "Don't let anyone tell you to compromise, kid," he'd say, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The truth is a stubborn thing. It'll find a way to get out, but it's a hell of a lot faster if you go looking for it." She took his words to heart, applying for jobs at a number of respected publications, her portfolio thick with articles that were already shaking things up. A local government scandal she'd uncovered, a detailed report on a housing corporation's questionable practices. She was on the cusp of everything she had ever wanted. The world was her oyster, and she was ready to crack it open. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A phone call in the middle of a cold October night changed everything. Her father, a man with a booming laugh and a heart as big as the sky, had fallen ill. The doctors were grim, the prognosis uncertain, and the medical bills, even with insurance, began to pile up like a mountain she couldn't climb. The dream of a byline and a Pulitzer Prize dimmed under the harsh reality of her father's illness. She dropped out of graduate school, the weight of her family's financial burden settling heavily on her shoulders. She needed money, and she needed it now. The job she found was the first steady one she could get, a paralegal position at a mid-sized law firm. It was supposed to be temporary, a temporary stop on her way back to her true calling. She told herself she would go back to journalism as soon as her father was better, as soon as they were on their feet again. What was supposed to be temporary became permanent. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The vibrant, ambitious journalist in the making was slowly replaced by a woman tethered to a desk, drowning in routine paperwork and the suffocating silence of compromise. The restless fire that had once burned so brightly inside her was now just a flicker, buried under the weight of long hours and legal jargon. She traded late-night research for late-night coffee runs, chasing briefs instead of leads. The world she once saw as a puzzle to be solved was now just a series of files to be organized, a mountain of paper that seemed to grow taller with each passing day. She tried to rationalize it, to tell herself that she was doing the right thing, that her father's health and their family's security were more important than her own aspirations. And they were. She truly believed that. But the truth was, a part of her was dying. A slow, agonizing death. Her ambition dimmed, and with it, her spirit. The woman who once chased truth was now a cog in a machine, her days filled with the mundane and the monotonous. Yet, buried deep inside her, beneath the layers of resignation and routine, that restless fire was not entirely extinguished. It had simply gone dormant. It was the part of her that made her notice things others ignored, the quiet part of her that had once demanded answers. It was this part of her that paid attention when files marked confidential arrived with rushed, secretive instructions. It was this part of her that noticed the clients who never appeared in person but wired obscene amounts of money. She would sit in her cubicle, the hum of the fluorescent lights a constant companion, and watch the senior partners, their faces a mask of professional politeness. She would see the furtive glances, the quiet handoffs, and a seed of suspicion would take root. It was the same suspicion she had felt when she was a young journalist, a familiar unease that told her something was not right, that there was a story hiding beneath the surface. Her investigative instincts, the very instincts she had tried to bury along with her dreams, were still alive. They were beginning to stir, a low rumble beneath the surface of her quiet, compromised life. The law firm, the very place that had become her cage, was now a new puzzle, one she couldn't ignore. She had traded her notebook for a legal pad, but the itch to uncover the truth was still there, a constant reminder of the woman she used to be. The files, the secretive clients, the hurried instructions, all of it was a breadcrumb trail leading to a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to find, a truth that could either reignite the fire within her or burn her to the ground. Elena hadn't always been alone. 2 years before that fateful night in the dimly lit bar, her life was an anchor of stability, held fast by a man named Daniel. He was a financial analyst, with a charm that could disarm a room and an ambition that mirrored her own. Their love story felt like a carefully crafted screenplay, full of shared dreams and whispered promises of a future they would build together. He was her rock, the calm center in the storm of her professional life, and their relationship was her sanctuary from the compromises she was forced to make at the law firm. They were engaged, the diamond on her finger a sparkling testament to a future she believed in, a future that promised a life free from the suffocating routine of her job. But as the days turned into weeks and their wedding date drew closer, a subtle unease began to creep into her life. It started with little things she couldn't quite place. Daniel's phone calls would become hushed when she entered the room. He would grow distant after a conversation, his eyes clouding over with a look she couldn't decipher. Her law firm, meanwhile, was getting more and more unusual clients. The names were always different, but the patterns were the same: shell companies, offshore accounts, and obscenely large wire transfers. The details were eerily similar to the financial crimes she'd read about in her journalism textbooks, and her dormant investigative instincts began to stir. The first major crack in her carefully constructed reality came when she was working late one night. She was preparing a brief for a new client, and a name on a financial document seemed to jump out at her. It was a name she had heard before, a name that was, at once, familiar and deeply unsettling. It was one of the clients her firm represented, and it was tied directly to Daniel. When she confronted him, a cold dread twisting in her stomach, he denied it. At first, he laughed, a brittle, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. He told her it was just a coincidence, that in the world of finance, names and companies often overlapped. But the warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, distant look she had never seen before. The days following her confrontation with Daniel were a living nightmare. He grew cold and distant, a stranger sharing her apartment. The easy laughter they once shared was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that hung between them like a shroud. Elena was left to question everything she thought she knew about their love. Had their love ever been real, or had it all been a performance? A sick, elaborate play designed to deceive her? She felt a sense of betrayal so profound it was physical, a constant ache in her chest. Then, one morning,